The night my neighbor said, "No one will ever love me," the city was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hear your own thoughts louder than traffic. I remember because I had just turned off the lights in my apartment, convinced sleep would finally come easily, when her voice floated up through the open window like a confession meant only for the dark. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't dramatic, it was exhausted, stripped of hope, and so final that it stopped me mid-step. I stood there, frozen, wondering if I was supposed to pretend I hadn't heard it, wondering if some truths were too fragile to touch. When I looked down and saw her sitting alone on the concrete steps, shoulders hunched, hair falling messily around her face, something inside me shifted. Maya wasn't someone I knew well. She was just the neighbor who lived across the hall, the woman who always smiled politely but never lingered, the one who returned packages for others but never had visitors herself. And yet, in that moment, she looked like someone drowning quietly, hoping no one would notice. When I finally spoke and said, "That's not true," my voice surprised even me. She looked up as if she'd been pulled out of a dream, embarrassment flashing across her face before it hardened into something like resignation. "You heard that?" she asked, forcing a laugh that didn't reach her eyes, and when I nodded, she shrugged like it didn't matter. "Then you heard the truth." There was no anger in her tone, just certainty. That was what scared me the most. People who believe their own hopelessness don't argue anymore. I told her she couldn't know that the future wasn't written yet, but she shook her head slowly and said, "People always leave when they know." That sentence followed me inside, echoed in my chest all night, and by the next evening, when I saw her sitting there again, I didn't hesitate. I brought coffee, not because it was special, but because it was something warm, something shared, something human. She warned me she didn't want pity, and I told her I wasn't offering any. That was the first real smile I saw on her face, brief but genuine, like sunlight slipping through clouds. We talked for hours, not about big dreams or dramatic pasts at first, but about small things, how silence can feel heavier than noise, how nights are harder because there's no distraction from your own thoughts, how loneliness doesn't always come from being alone but from feeling unseen. Slowly, the walls she'd built began to crack, and when she finally said, "There's a reason no one stays," I knew I was standing at the edge of something important. I didn't interrupt her, didn't rush her, just listened as she explained how she'd spent her whole life being labeled difficult, fragile, broken in ways that weren't visible but were deeply felt. When she told me about her condition, about not being able to have children, her voice didn't shake. She spoke like someone who had rehearsed the pain until it no longer surprised her. She told me how she always told the truth early, how people said it didn't matter until one day it suddenly did, how love would fade quietly, politely, like she was an inconvenience no one wanted to admit. When she said, "So yes, no one will ever love me," it wasn't self-pity, it was acceptance. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about romance. It was about worth. About whether someone could choose to stay even when there was nothing to gain. I told her I was here, and she told me everyone was, at first. But I looked at her, really looked at her, and said, "I'm not going anywhere," without thinking about what that might cost me. When she broke down then, it wasn't loud or messy. It was quiet, shoulders shaking, tears falling into her hands like she'd finally allowed herself to believe, even for a second, that maybe she didn't have to carry everything alone. That night changed something between us, not because we made promises, but because I stayed until her tears slowed, until the coffee went cold, until the silence felt less heavy than before. And as I walked back to my apartment, I realized something unsettling and beautiful. I didn't stay because I felt sorry for her. I stayed because her truth mattered to me. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Love didn't announce itself in our lives, it settled in quietly, like dust on a windowsill, unnoticed until it was everywhere. After the night Maya told me her secret, something unspoken began to grow between us. We didn't talk about it. We didn't define it. We simply existed in the same space more often than before, and somehow, that became enough. Mornings turned into shared coffee rituals, evenings into long conversations that wandered from childhood memories to fears we'd never admitted out loud. I learned that she loved thunderstorms but hated sunny goodbyes, that she reread the same book whenever life felt unstable, that she had once dreamed of being a painter but gave it up after someone told her dreams were luxuries for people with guarantees. And she learned things about me too, how I avoided talking about my past because it reminded me of everything I'd lost, how I stayed busy to avoid feeling empty, how I had also been left behind more times than I wanted to remember. One night, while we sat on the balcony watching the city lights flicker like distant stars, she asked me a question that stopped my breath. "What if one day you realize I can't give you the life you want?" she asked softly, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound calm. I didn't answer immediately because the truth deserved respect. Then I said, "What if the life I want is already here?" She stared at me like she was trying to see whether I meant it or was just being kind, and when she realized I wasn't joking, tears filled her eyes, not the broken kind this time, but the kind that comes when hope is terrifying because it asks you to trust again. She pulled away slightly, whispering, "People promise things when they feel close. Then reality shows up." I took her hand then, not dramatically, not urgently, just firmly enough to let her feel I was real. "I'm not afraid of your reality," I said. "I'm afraid of a world where you believe you're unlovable." That was the night she leaned into me for the first time, her head resting against my shoulder like it had always belonged there, and in that simple moment, I understood something powerful. Love isn't about fixing someone or saving them. It's about choosing to stay while they learn to believe they're worth staying for. Weeks later, when someone from her past reached out, someone who had once walked away because he wanted things she couldn't give, she panicked, afraid it would scare me off, afraid I'd finally understand why everyone left. Instead, I listened. I didn't compare myself. I didn't compete. I simply stayed, again and again, until she realized staying wasn't something I did out of obligation, it was something I chose. One evening, as she looked at me with disbelief still lingering in her eyes, she whispered, "You're still here." I smiled and replied, "I told you. I'm here to stay." And for the first time in her life, she didn't argue with that truth. She just believed it. If this chapter touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Every subscription helps bring more powerful, emotional stories like this to life, and your support means more than you know.